So happy to have everyone with us for another class of Drisha today. So glad to be learning together. Today's class is the philosophy of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks with Rabbi Alex Israel. Once again, just I'll be sending everyone an invitation to become a panelist, so that would allow you to unmute and ask questions. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Israel.
So delighted to see you all. And we are going to be today studying a book. So far, let me just explain. We gave an introduction our first week. Last time we decided to dive in to the deep end by looking at Rabbi Sacks's most controversial book, The Dignity of Difference. And I just wanted to add a comment which came up last week. I see that not everybody who was here last week is here, but maybe they'll see the recording. And that is one of the questions that I was asked by somebody, I think one of the rabbis who was on the call last week, was about whether Rabbi Sacks applied the same sort of attitude of a sort of pluralism or an attitude of multiple perspectives to non-Orthodox denominations of Judaism. And I just wanted, I didn't say it at the time because it sort of slipped my mind. But what I'd like to add is that Rabbi Sacks was very preoccupied by this question, especially early on in his career. And if you want to read up more about Rabbi Sacks's attitude towards non-Orthodox denominations and the way he looked at it, he wrote a whole book on this topic. It's called One People. And, you know, he applied a different lens to non-Orthodox denominations than he did to the question of other religions. But if you want to investigate it, the book is called One People, ? And it's worthwhile getting hold of. It's a book that was published in the early 90s. So I'd suspect 92 or 93. And you can take a look there. Today, we're going to study a different book, and that is going to be the book Radical Then, Radical Now, which in America was published under the title, A Letter in the Scroll. I don't know why they used a different title in the United States. I sometimes wonder whether the word radical was too radical for America, if I may venture that guess. Maybe it's got a positive lilt in England and not so positive in the rest of the world. And it was called A Letter in the Scroll in the United States. And it's a fabulous book. And the reason why I've chosen to talk about it a little bit is because for Rabbi Sacks, it is his Ani Ma'amin. It is his, we're going to see a video at the end today where Rabbi Sacks talks about why I am a Jew. And if you look at the subtitle of this book, as you can see on the screen, Understanding Our Jewish Identity and Exploring the Legacy of the World's Oldest Religion. You know what, let's just begin by looking at what is the preface of the book. And this is what he says. Today, throughout the diaspora, 1 Jew in 2 is either marrying out or not marrying, or in some way deciding not to create a Jewish home, have Jewish children, and continue the Jewish story. At such moments rare in our history, we or our children face the question, who am I and why should I remain a Jew? That question can never be answered in the abstract. It's intensely personal and demands a personal reply. This is my personal reply, says Rabbi Sacks. None of us can answer this question for anyone else, but it sometimes helps to know how other people have thought about it, which is why I've decided to publish this book as an open letter to the next generation. If you, like me, are a big believer in, for example, buying books for people's bar mitzvahs or bat mitzvahs, this is, to my mind, the bar mitzvah book to buy because it's also been translated into Hebrew. Why? Because it talks in a very intelligent but very direct way and asks the question, why be Jewish? And that's, you can hear what he's saying. Now, let me just say that for Rabbi Sacks, this question of Jewish continuity plagued him throughout his life, not plagued him, inspired him throughout his life. What I mean by that is, that before he became chief rabbi, he had various jobs. He was a lecturer in Jews College and other places. He was a rabbi of a community. He was the head of Jews College, which was the rabbinic training seminary for rabbis in London, which also gave degrees in other Judaic studies. But Rabbi Sacks focused a lot of attention on what we might call Jewish continuity. So much so that when he was trying to, sort of, if you want, launch his career towards the chief rabbinate, he set up an educational organization which was known as Jewish Continuity. That was the name. Jewish Continuity was at the heart of what he wanted to do. As far as Rabbi Sacks was concerned, one of the greatest successes of his period as chief rabbi was that the number of children in Jewish schools, Jewish children in Jewish day schools, rose dramatically. It was already a process started by his predecessor, by Rabbi Emanuel Jacobovitz, but he instigated and encouraged the opening of new Jewish schools to a point that, if I'm not mistaken, over 75% of Jewish children in Britain had some sort of day school education, if not at the secondary school level, at the elementary school level. So Jewish continuity and the question of how to continue the Jewish people and make sure that people got an understanding of Judaism, this was sort of pretty at the center of his mind. So we're going to really, what this book is about is an argument to explain why be Jewish, what is significant about being Jewish. So I want to start by actually looking at the table of contents. And that's what I put here, because it'll give you a sense of the line of his argument. Okay, why be Jewish? He raises the question, we just raised the question, why be Jewish? And then he gives a bunch of answers. And his answers, he's not happy with. He gives all sorts of answers of different people. And some people even said, there's no point in being Jewish, or we should be Jewish for all sorts of reasons. And he then goes into, who am I, who are we? And chapter 4, a letter in the scroll. I'm sorry, that should have been on a new line. A letter in the scroll. And it's this that I want to pay our attention to. He then goes in part 2 to a journey. And this is going to be a journey through the Bible. He's going to start with a palace in flames. We're going to do this piece together. And then the idea of man, that's about Book of Genesis. Covenantal morality is going to be about more like Shemot. The chosen people is going to be about the rest of the Torah. And so he's going to go through tragedy and triumph is going to be about how we survived tragedies like the destruction of our temple, the Inquisitions, and even the Holocaust. Truth lived is going to be about halakha and what it means to live a Jewish lifestyle, and so far, and so on and so forth. So he's going through the Jewish bookshelf, going through Jewish history, and explaining how this is going to work. So let's set sail into the world of Rabbi Sacks and start with the letter in the scroll. Now, hold on 1 minute, I just want to make sure. Okay, here we go. He says like this, I love this image, and that's why I'm starting with it. We are in a vast library. In every direction we look, there are bookcases. Each has shelves stretching from the floor to the ceiling, and every shelf is full of books. We're surrounded by the recorded thoughts of many people, some great, some less so. And we can reach out and take any book we wish. All we have to do is choose. We begin to read. We can break off and try a different subject or a different approach. There's no limit. Once the book no longer interests us, we can put it back on the shelf, where it'll wait for the next reader to pick it up. It makes no claim on us. It's just a book. Let's go to the next paragraph. He says, I'll highlight where I'm beginning to read. He says, imagine that while browsing at the library, you come across one book unlike the rest. It catches your eye because on the spine is written the name of your family. Intrigued, you open it and see many pages written by different hands in many languages. You start reading it, and gradually you begin to understand what it is. It's the story of the generation of your ancestors as told for the sake of the next, so that everyone born into this family can learn where they came from, what happened to them, what they lived for, and why. As you turn the pages, you reach the last, which carries no entry, but a heading. It bears your name. Now, in other words, what Rabbi Sacks is going to do in this passage is he essentially says that being in that library, imagine you're in the Bodleian Library, the Library of Congress, endless books. You can take this one off the shelf or that one off the shelf. It makes no demands on me. But suddenly I find a book which is all my ancestors, and the last page is blank. It's got my name at the top. Don't you want to write your page, he says? Don't you want to add, or what? You're going to just like not carry on this, you're not going to carry on this letter? You're not going to carry on this book? That's his biggest argument here. Don't you want to be a Jew? Look what we've got, right? And he continues and says here, were I to find myself holding such a book in my hands, my life would already have been changed. Seeing my name and the story of my forebears, I could not read it as if it was just one story or other. Instead, reading it would inevitably become for me a form of self-discovery. Once I knew that it existed, I could not put the book back on the shelf and forget it, because I would now know that I am part of a long line of people who travel towards a certain destination and whose journey remains unfinished, dependent on me to take it further. And he finishes by saying, I am a Jew because, knowing the story of my people, I hear their call to write the next chapter. I didn't come from nowhere. I have a past. And if any past commands anyone, this past commands me. So this is his first statement. I like to go to one other statement and to say the following. Rabbi Sacks is going to argue, let's just, I'm going to in a minute ask people to maybe read for a minute on their own, but let me say something else that he says in this image, because on the one hand, this is the scroll, right? So this is the book, but there's a different meaning of the letter in the scroll. And here he relates to a Kabbalistic teaching from the Zohar, where the Zohar says that there are in fact 600,000 Jews and there are 600,000 letters in the Sefer Torah. Now, I don't think we should get too caught up in details because there actually are not 600,000 letters in the Torah, but something approximating them. And of course, there were 603,550 men who came out of Egypt. What about the women? What about the children? Whichever way, there's this mythic number of 600,000, okay? In fact, there's a special bracha to be said over such things. 600,000. Rabbi Sacks says, last week we saw in Rabbi Sacks that Rabbi Sacks sees a great affinity between language and identity. Multiple languages meant multiple religions and multiple identities. This goes to the core of Rabbi Sacks's idea of how each person learns their own world through language. And he starts at the very beginning that there are 600,000 Jews and there are 600,000 letters in a Sefer Torah. And if the Sefer Torah is missing one letter, it is invalid. And therefore, Rabbi Sacks is going to say that if any one Jew is missing, it's invalid. What Rabbi Sacks is doing is, he's doing, if you want, the vertical is, who are my forebears? And I'm at the end of this long chain, right? And I need to be true to that history. And then he's doing something horizontal. We've got all the Jews, and we can't manage without even one Jew being part of the Jewish people. What are our responsibilities? How does this call upon me? If I am a Jew, I can't deny if I don't play my part, if I don't put up my hand and say, I'm a Jew, then the Sefer Torah is invalid, right? The human Sefer Torah, right? So this is where Rabbi Sacks is coming from in chapter 4, in the chapter of the letter in the scroll. And now I just want you to maybe actually we'll read together. And I'll just, sorry if I'm doing a lot of reading, but here are some great stories. I'll try and summarize the stories for you. But let's just read a little bit here. There are many opinions as to the identity of Jacob's mysterious adversary. The simplest and deepest is that it was Jacob himself. His greatest struggle was internal. In other words, we all remember the situation of Jacob fighting with the angel, with the mysterious man in the night. Who is he fighting? He says, it was Jacob himself. This is a very audacious reading. It was his alter ego. His greatest struggle was internal. And what's that struggle? Remember, Jacob gets the new name, Yisrael, instead of Yaakov. What's Yaakov? Holding onto the heel of Esau. Okay? What's Yisrael? That you can prevail, you can manage by yourself. And here's the question. Would he spend his life wishing he was someone else? Or would he be asked to be content who he was? His struggle ended when he was able to let go of all the things he had clung to in the past. According to this reason, Jacob became Israel when he learned to be proud to be Jacob. No longer hold on to Esau's heel. His blessing, his identity, his name. Jacob finally conquered his sense of inadequacy and learned to be himself. For the first time, he can meet his brother without envy, deception, or fear. The next morning, the brothers meet, and the conflict between them seems to have disappeared. They kiss, speak in friendship, and each goes its own way. If Jacob has the courage to be Jacob, then he's conquered his fear of Esau. So this is his third argument, if you want, to Jews who are assimilating or thinking of assimilating. Be yourself. In other words, not only be true to your ancestors, not only play a role as a letter in the scroll, but be yourself. You have so much to give. And here, by the way, he tells us 3 stories, right? Before we get to the stories, let's just read one more. The scene has often replayed itself at critical junctures in Jewish history. Time and time again, Jews confronted nations larger than themselves, more powerful, more secure, more at home in the world. For example, ancient Egypt and Persia, Greece and Rome, Europe of the Enlightenment. Each time, there were Jews who were not sure they wanted to be Jews. And isn't that wonderful, right? The rabbis say this about Persia. They say it about Egypt, that in Egypt, 4/5, 80% of the Jews didn't want to leave. They say that in Persia, there were Jews who wanted to be more Persian. Greece, the Hellenizers, the Europe of the Enlightenment. So he says they assimilated or Hellenized or secularized. Each one of these encounters was a collective crisis of Jewish identity, a paralyzing self-doubt. Jews didn't want to belong to the club that would have them as a member. They were Jacobs who didn't want to be Jacob. And he writes here, I recall 3 primal scenes that made a difference to my life. If you've got the sheet in front of you, you can read them yourself, but I'll just relate 2 of them, okay? The first one, he tells a lovely story when he was a little boy and he was on vacation, and they went to shul, him and his father, on Shabbat. And as he was leaving the synagogue, a man came running after him and said, hey, hey, hey. And he said, what? He says to his father, his father was probably wearing a hat. Your son still has his yarmulke on. He forgot to take it off. Assuming that the only place he would wear a yarmulke would be in the synagogue and not in the street. And he said his father was a very mild man, but he turned around with a sort of venomous response and said, no son of mine is ever going to be embarrassed to be a Jew. Right? It's a lovely story, right? He said he never know where that pride came into his father. Right? He tells another story about how when he was a student, he was learning all of this world knowledge. And he was like, I'm learning all of this phenomenal world knowledge. What do I do with my due date, right? And he actually wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He wrote a letter to the Lubavitcher Rebbe and said, Rabbi, how do I deal with this? There's so many bits of knowledge in the world. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe responds with an amazing parable. And he says, imagine somebody gave you a bag of rocks to carry, right? You'd say they were just a bag of rocks. But imagine that you have your own special collection of rocks, their diamonds or their emeralds. Suddenly, when somebody gives you some of their stones to carry, you'll realize how valuable they are. He says, only when you understand what you have will you appreciate what other people have. And Rabbi Sacks gives a lovely third story. And I love this third story. He says one day, he was in Cambridge, and it was a very windy day, and he's walking to the college through the playing fields of the college. Imagine him walking through the grass. Actually usually says don't walk on the grass in Cambridge. Anyway, and he said it was very windy, so he took off his kippah and held it in his hand. 2 days later, the provost of the department called him in and said, "Jonathan, is everything all right?" And he said, "What do you mean, is everything all right? Everything's just fine." He said, "Well, the other day, I saw you without your skull cap, and I was wondering whether you were having a bit of a crisis of faith." And he said, he was just amazed at this story. Here, I'll share the screen again. He says, one second, here we go. He said, yeah, I'm highlighting. "I suddenly realized that though he was not Jewish, he was deeply troubled at the thought that I might be losing my faith, without a philosophical doubt or sheer isolation of being the only religious Jew on campus. I don't know if even now I fully understand his reaction, but I think it meant that my being truth to my faith was part of the security of his world. Since then, I've encountered this phenomenon so many times in different ways that I'm tempted to assert it in the form of two principles, which, if not always true, are true more often than not. Non-Jews respect Jews who respect Judaism, and they are embarrassed by Jews who are embarrassed by Judaism, right? I'll say that along with the other rule, which is those who are most ease in their faith have the capacity to recognize moral and spiritual greatness in whatever form it takes. What's Rabbi Sacks arguing against here? He's arguing against something. And he's arguing against this fear that by deepening our Judaism, we become more parochial, we become narrower, we become stuck in our own narrow world. And Rabbi Sacks says, number one, I want to be proud to be a Jew. Number two, the fact that I am a proud Jew and that I have my own faith means that I can appreciate things with other people. And third, by being proud of my Judaism, non-Jews are even embarrassed by Jews who are embarrassed by their Judaism. When we stand for something, people are proud of it. So this is, if you want, the beginning of stage one of the argument. Why be a Jew? Because your forebears have passed a chain of tradition and you're the next in the chain. You're going to give it up. You're not going to write your page. Number two, a letter in a scroll, right? If one Jew isn't there, we all add something. And number three, don't think that digging into your Jewish identity means becoming more narrow. It will merely widen you up. It will induce respect. So he's here in these passages addressing the human aspect. And this is the meaning of the letter in the scroll. But I want to share with you the next stage of the argument. And the next stage of the argument is radical then, radical now. And that was the British title. And what he means to say by that is that Judaism is not backwards. Judaism is not primitive. Judaism has the most important ideas which can shape our world. So let's begin where he begins in chapter, I think it is chapter 5, a palace in flames. And I'm only beginning here, even though it's not quite the beginning of the story, because Rabbi Sacks begins here, and he loved this midrash. The midrash is about the phrase, Vayoma Hashem el Avram, lech lecha. Right? Avraham is told, right, leave your land, your birthplace, lech lecha, go for yourself. So the midrash now gives a wonderful image of a palace in flames. To what may this be compared? To a man who was traveling from place to place, and he saw a palace in flames. Now, you know what, in a minute, I'll say something about this. He wondered, is it possible that the palace lacks an owner? Where's the owner? The owner of the palace looked down and said, I'm the owner of the palace. So Abraham, his father, said, is it possible the world lacks a ruler? The Holy One, blessed be he, and looked and said to him, I am the ruler, the sovereign of the universe, and lech lecha. Now, of course, let me explain that not everybody translates this idea of a palace in flames like Rabbi Sacks, because the Hebrew is bira achat doleket. A bira is indeed a palace or a large mansion. But the word doleket could mean one of two things. It could mean that it is on fire. That's how Rabbi Sacks interprets it. Or alternatively, it could mean doleket, meaning that the lights are on. It is illuminated. That's what it might be. Rabbi Sacks chooses the second reason, but in a minute we'll see other people use the first. Now, the question that the Midrash is trying to address, of course, is what called Avraham? What induced Avraham to go on his way? And this is almost saying that Avraham saw a palace on flames, and somehow, interesting thing is that God's there, but he doesn't want to put out the flames. And by the way, there is another way to read it, which is that Avraham saw a beautiful palace with lights on, and he said, is there an owner? And then God reached out and said, I'm the owner. So let's take a look. So let's see where he goes. With this, we arrive at the starting point of Jewish faith, radical then, radical now, perhaps still not fully understood. Faith is not born in the answer, but in the question, not in harmony, but in dissonance. Again, Rabbi Sacks loved talking about this idea. The faith doesn't give us sort of comfort, it sort of gives us discomfort. If God created the world, then he created man. Why then does he allow man to destroy the world? How are we to reconcile the order of nature with the disorder of society? Can God have made the world only to abandon it? From time immemorial to the present, there have always been two ways of seeing the world. The first says, there is no God. There are contending forces, chance and necessity. The chance that produces variation, the necessity that gives the strong victory over the weak. There is no palace. There are only flames. The second view insists that there is a God. All that exists because he made it. All that happened transpires because he willed it. Therefore, all injustice is an illusion. By the way, one of the thinkers who felt this, or maybe read it this different way, was Maimonides. Maimonides read the Bira Doleket as meaning that he saw a magnificent palace with the lights on. He saw the heavens, he saw the angels, he saw science, he saw everything, and everything was in order. Nothing was on flame, said the Rambam. But Rabbi Sacks is saying, some people say they're secular, and they say, this is a world of pain. It's a world of flames. There is no God. Other people say, there is a God. You just don't see the beauty in the world. And all injustice is an illusion. Evil is the cloak that masks the good. There's a question, and there's always an answer. There is a palace, therefore there are no flames. Maybe the important thing here is, therefore there are no flames. God created nature, symbolized by the palace, but God seeking relationship created one being capable of self-consciousness, and therefore freedom, and thus the ability to choose evil. Man, having this ability, uses it. He sets fire to the palace, setting the world aflame. God can, but may not, put out the fire, for if he does so, man is no longer free. So here's Rabbi Sacks's important notion where he talks about human beings are free. Nature is beautiful. It works, but it works on a pre-programmed way. God created a beautiful structure, which is nature. But who is the random element in the world? It's humans. I don't know if you've read Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens, but there he very much has the attitude that the world is perfect and human beings just mess it up from the beginning of civilization. But Rabbi Sacks says, if God wants human beings to be free and to have the ability to choose, they've got to be able to choose good or evil. And now he says this, only man can put out the fire. If humans made the fire, only man, but man is not alone. For God, the author of self-consciousness, is also the author of language. God not only creates, he communicates. God speaks to man and tells him how to extinguish the flames. Morality is not factual, how things are, or subjective, how we desire them to be, but covenantal, meaning God gives his word to man and man gives his word to God. God teaches, man's acts, and together they begin the task of tikkun olam, repairing or mending the world. They become, in the rabbinic phrase, partners in the work of creation. 4,000 years later, this is still a revolutionary idea and still an unfinished task. The faith of Jews, beginning with Abraham, reaching its most detailed expression in the covenant of Sinai, envisioned by the prophets, articulated by the sages, right? By the way, notice he starts with Bible, Abraham, Sinai, prophets, sages. Is that just by acting in response to the call of God, collectively, we can change the world. Flames of injustice, violence, and oppression are not inevitable. The victory of the strong over the weak, the many over the few, the manipulative over those who act with integrity, even though they have happened at most times and in most places, are not written into the structure of the universe. And we're going to talk a bit more about this in a few minutes. So this is one of the areas in which Rabbi Sacks argues that Judaism is radical then and radical now. Many religions say God is good. It has to be, obviously it's God's will, even when things happen for the bad. Other systems say they're atheistic. They say there can't be a God because look at all the pain in the world. And Rabbi Sacks says, no, Judaism is different. We know that the palace is on flames. The first moment when Abraham was called, what was God saying? Lech lecha. He was saying, you're the guy. If you see dissonance in the world, if you're unsatisfied, remember Abraham was traveling already. He found the world a difficult place to live in. He looked for God. He looked for the owner of the palace. He says, the world's on flames. Where's God? And God said, I'm the owner of the palace, but lech lecha, you go. And of course, what does Abraham do?
Does he see a link between radical and roots, as in roots of genealogy?
Roots of?
Genealogy.
Genealogy, you mean your personal roots?
Yes. Does Rabbi Sacks see that, make that word play?
I don't think so. I think what Rabbi Sacks does with the radical is what he's essentially going to say is that Judaism always goes in opposition to the systems that are in place at the time. Let me try and give two examples where Rabbi Sacks is going to say this. Rabbi Sacks starts actually with Bereshit. And he says that Bereshit, the creation story, is in itself a radical text. He said, if you look at all of the world of ancient mythology, in the world of ancient mythology, take the Enuma Elish of the Babylonians or any of the myths, what generally happens is that the gods don't really want human beings in the world. The gods are fighting each other, backstabbing, having sex, having children. Gods are part of nature. The god of the rain, that was the Baal in Canaan. The god of the sun, that was Ra in Egypt, and so forth and so forth. Gods are bound by rules. They're bound by nature. And the gods are always hierarchical. So there is a pantheon, and the head of the pantheon, right, is the most powerful thing. And everybody's got to be scared of them because they have the power. They have the power to impose on us. In fact, human rulers in Babylonia and in Egypt were part of the pantheon too. They were the Son of God. They were there in order to instill order in the world. So listen, he says, to what happens in Judaism. In Judaism, we read, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. What does that mean? God is not in nature, and nature is not a God. He says that's amazing. You just demythologized the whole of nature. He says, really, what we've actually done in Bereshit is open the door to science, because Bereshit gives us 7 days, and we start, if you want, with the mineral, and then the vegetable, and then the animal, and then the human. It's very logical. And the human is described as the image of God. And what's the image of God? God is a creator. Man is told to create. Man is told to be responsible. God says, I'm leaving. Man, you're in charge. You've got your own choices. In the very next story, man makes mistakes. God gives him consequences. Says Rabbi Sacks, in the ancient world, most human beings, there was a human being who was in the image of God. You know who that was? The king. The king was in the image of God. In the Jewish system, everybody's in the image of God. That means everybody has a right to be here. In the image of the Canaanite system or the Babylonian system, human beings were just serfs. They were like pawns. They were like creatures to serve royalty. In this way, what does Bereshit teach us? Bereshit teaches us, demythologizes nature, says that God isn't part of nature. God doesn't do things because he needs to eat or because he's jealous. God does things because they're right or because they're wrong. Human beings have responsibility. Human beings have dignity. Human beings have freedom. Human beings have responsibility. That reprograms humanity. That's why all the Western world is nourished by this narrative, which came from our Bible, which came from God's revelation to the Jewish people. That's radical. I'll give you another example of something that's radical. I'll put it on the sheets just now. Let's see if we can, hold on. Yeah, let's look at source 7 here. Here's another thing which is radical. God, who led his people from slavery to freedom, desires the free worship of human beings. Notice, Rabbi Sacks is very into freedom, and he desires the free worship of free human beings. To be sure, there's a strange and famous statement in the Talmud when God gave Israel the Torah, he suspended Mount Sinai above their heads and said, if you accept it, well and good. If not, this will be your burial place. According to this, once Jews had been chosen, they had no choice but to accept the terms of Jewish life. However, the rabbis immediately rejected this idea. If so, there's a fundamental objection to the Torah, for there can be no covenant without voluntary acceptance. The Jewish people said, na'aseh v'nishma. In fact, I'd say more than that. The Jewish people said first, na'aseh, and then a second time, na'aseh, and the third time, na'aseh v'nishma. Judaism is a supreme expression of religion as freedom, and hence the priority of faith over fate. Right? In other words, what he says is Judaism is compelling not because of its coercive force, its implacable fate, but because of its moral beauty and spiritual grace. For Rabbi Sacks, Bereshit is radical. Sinai is radical. Sinai is radical because God gave us a choice. And other things are radical too. You know what? I'm going to go back to these relationships of Genesis are radical. Let me give another example, and then we'll go to our final example, and then we'll watch the video. So let's look at this. Rabbi Sacks begins with, and again, even look at this title, relationship, source 6, relationship and sexuality is the foundation of free society. The first time man meets woman, man bursts into song. Vayoma Adam, Zot apam, etzem me'atzamai u'basar mibsari, Zot yikare isha ki mi'yishluka chazot. Now at last, the bone of my bones and the flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman, Isha. She was taken from man. Now I have to tell you something about this lovely line. What's lovely about it is that until this point in the book of Genesis, Adam has never been called Ish. He's only been called Adam because he comes from Adamah. So he's called the earthling or something like that. He's the earthman. He's never been called Ish. The first time the word Ish comes is after he uses the word Isha. Look at this lovely phrase by Rabbi Sacks. Here for the first time we encounter a fateful proposition. Man must pronounce the name of a woman before he pronounces his own name. He has to recognize the other before he can recognize himself. Maybe he is sort of, he has to say thou before he can say I. Only by recognizing the other as bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh do we discover ourselves. And now, one final thing. The people of Genesis are not saints. The subjects of Genesis are for the first time ordinary human beings in ordinary situations. There is not the slightest attempt to romanticize the family bond. Relationships are difficult. even for these archetypal figures, but they take place in a moral context. The family is the place within which, even if we have to struggle with others and ourselves, we learn what it is to be human. One of the stunning revelations Judaism would eventually undertake was the moralization of power, the idea that even rulers are bound by rules. Before that, another idea had to take place, the moralization of sex. The book of Genesis describes a series of incidents in which a member of the covenantal family steps outside his own territory, the home, the tent, the tribe. Abraham goes to Sarah, is taken by Pharaoh into Pharaoh's harem. The same thing happens later to Isaac when they enter the territory of Avimelech. When Lot has visited in Sodom, his tent, his house is besieged by the local populace who say, "Bring them out so we may know them." An episode which conferred the word sodomy on the English language. Dinah, taking a walk, is raped and abducted by Shem. Joseph in Egypt is propositioned and almost seduced by Potiphar's wife. Outside its own boundaries, ancient Israel encounters a world of sexual anarchy in which anything goes. Sexual relationships are the test of all else. Do I respect other people as persons in their own right? Or do I see them as means to my ends, instruments of my pleasure? Do I relate to you in freedom and dignity, or do I simply use you? The nature of the sexual encounter will not immediately, but eventually affect all other social relationships. Now, Rabbi Sacks is saying this, but you have to understand that that was the world of the gods. The gods also imposed their sexual desires on the gods who were lower than them. Look what Rabbi Sacks is saying. He's saying human dignity, freedom, consent, demytholization of power, the non-domination of sex, the beginning of human relationships, the ability to pronounce the name of the other before I even understand myself. All of this is contained within those stories we know so well from Bereshit. This is radical stuff. And if you believe in the values of the Western world, don't you realize we've been talking about this for 4,000 years? The world just caught up. Aren't you proud of this? Right? So this is what Rabbi Sacks is getting all excited about. So I think this is some significant stuff. So if our first half, he's really appealing to the contemporary Jew and says, what is your standing in this world? Now he says, go look in our tradition and see just how amazing it is. And now let's go to a third area. And the third area, and then maybe I'll stop for some questions. Let's look at source number, sorry, I'm going a bit topsy-turvy here, but let's take a look at source number 4. And this relates to halacha. Walk into a shop, hand over a coin and buy a newspaper. No transaction could be simpler. You do it without thinking about it. And in this one event, you're living on the surface of a series of institutions that, fully excavated, will tell half the story of mankind. The coin tells of the long evolution of man from hunter-gatherer to city dweller, where specialization and the division of labor led to the necessity of exchange, and thus a medium of exchange, and so eventually money. First as something valuable in itself, precious metal, and then as an abstract token. The newspaper speaks of a series of technological advances from writing to printing to the most modern forms of instantaneous global communication. It's part of political history that gave us the idea that in a free society, we're entitled to open access to information. And now, so he said, just give the money, take the newspaper. These are revolutionary. In small actions is a huge thing. And now he says, to be a Jew is on the face of it, to be involved in simple things. Where's he going with this? Where he's going with this is the idea that halacha, Jewish law and Jewish practices, they're not just random acts, but the various practices that we have are almost like an iceberg. We only see the actions, but underneath this actions are a huge base, a huge pyramid of ideas, and that we shouldn't belittle the ideas, or we shouldn't belittle, maybe I should say it the other way around, we shouldn't belittle the actions, because within those actions inhere certain phenomenal values. And in this regard, by the way, he talks about the importance of family, of community, of Shabbat, and all sorts of other things which enhance humanity spirituality, and what have you. So he has the historical side, as I said. He then gets into the halachic, where he goes through many, many different areas of halacha. And on this basis of the coin and the newspaper, he describes to you all of the values of halacha. And then he gets to one last point, which I'm going to get to, and that is, again, the importance of autonomy, the importance of hope. Hope is one of Rabbi Sacks's tremendous themes throughout his books. And one of the things that he loved doing was bashing Greek thought. Obviously, Greek thought is the basis of so much philosophy, and he was a philosopher and trained in philosophical thinking. And yet, look at what he says here. The great literary genre of ancient Greece was tragedy, and tragedy is born in the idea that there is fate that is inexorable. Man struggles against it and is always doomed to failure. In Judaism, there is no fate that is inevitable. Israel had prophets, Greeks had oracles. The difference between them is that oracle predicts the future, while a prophet warns against it. If the foretold future comes to pass, the oracle has succeeded, but the prophet has failed. Judaism is therefore the systematic rejection of tragedy in the name of hope. But he says, but does this make a difference now? Remember, radical then, radical now. And he says, I think it makes all the difference in the world. We might think the great concepts, individual rights, moral freedom, religious pluralism, have been incorporated into the civilization of the West, and there's no more work for Judaism to do. I believe the opposite is true. The 20th century is a regression from Judaic values, not an advance beyond them. And let's see what he says. The whole thrust of modern thought has been to reducing the sphere of individual moral responsibility. Human behavior is increasingly seen as the product of impersonal forces: economic, Marx; social, Durkheim; or social biological, the neo-Darwinians. What we're witnessing because of things over which we have no control, what we are because we have things over which we have no control, from the distribution of power to the selfish gene. In other words, what did Marx say? There are big economic forces and they're beyond your control. What did Durkheim say? Sociology controls you. What did Freud say? Your psychology controls you. What did the neo-Darwinians say? It's sociobiology. We have no control. So if we want to change ourselves, we have, through political, technological revolution, to change the world. And he says there are two possible outcomes. The first dominated the first half of the 20th century, says you change the individual by changing the world. The individual becomes subsidiary to the mass, the nation, the state. There have been two such experiments this century: the Third Reich and the Soviet Union. They were the most brutal tyrannies known to man. In other words, Rabbi Sacks says, we cannot give the system to the state. The second now dominates the late 20th century, and of course the 21st, gives up on change altogether. You can't change. You're just your DNA, you're just your genes. Against this, 4,000 years ago, there emerged a different view of human life. It's just that individuals are not powerless in the face of the impersonal. We can create families, communities, even societies around the ideas of love, faithfulness, and trust. We can change ourselves. And through covenantal relationship with others, we can change the world. Far from being obsolete, this view is as challenging today as it was then. The idols have changed, but they have not ceased to be idols. So this is Rabbi Sacks's. I hope you've got a bit of a sense of what we mean by radical then, radical now. Rabbi Sacks is arguing that Judaism brought these ideas into the world, and they're still critical. They're still critical for the flourishing of civilization. And that this treasure trove is ours. And it needs us to pass it on, or else it'll be lost. And the world needs it. So I don't know if anybody has questions, comments. Now's a great time.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that affects the identity of the Jew is his roots. These roots make him radical, and that's why we have Ele Toldot as a leitmotif in Breshit. Whether or not Rabbi Sacks said this or not, I think he would have agreed.
Okay, so what you're actually saying is it's some way biological, genealogical. Is that what you mean? That it's actually in our DNA, so to speak?
Yeah, no, radical. The root of the word radical is root. And that is
I see.
what Ele Toldot is about.
I see. Okay.
You said that when you see your name in a book, you want to read it. That's a beautiful metaphor, and that's what the Torah is all about.
Yofi, beautiful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you, yes, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks.
Hi.
In this context, you have a very auspicious name. Rabbi J.
do, don't I?
Rabbi J. Sacks.
Yes, thank you. As you were reading the part about the palace and radical amazement, it reminded me very much of Heschel when he was writing about a palace and time, about time and space, and the importance of radical amazement. And there were sections of that kept echoing those concepts, but expanding on them in a different way. And I found it very compelling. The other, of course, I think, of course, is the looking at Abraham as seeing a burning palace, the analogy to the burning bush, the story of
lovely. Wow. So first of all, that's fabulous, right? The burning palace and the burning bush. And you're right. This might be his Moshe moment, right? This might be his Moses moment. And it's interesting how maybe the Midrash is actually putting the Moshe story into the Abraham story, because we don't have enough backstory on Abraham, and sort of like inserting the burning bush into the Abraham story. By the way, I will say that even though Rabbi Sacks wrote beautifully about Moses, if I can think of one biblical character who he constantly comes back to, especially when it comes to his interfaith work and his work for pluralism and for rereading the relationship between the three main monotheistic faiths, he constantly comes back to Abraham. And he says, Abraham used to say this line, Abraham, who was a man who never had any real estate, and he almost didn't have any children, and he didn't have a place. And he was a person who would believe that he's now followed by, what seen as by 2 million Muslims and 1.3 million Christians and, 15 million Jews or whatever it might be. I don't know quite the statistics. Rabbi Sacks was expert at like rolling them off his tongue. So for him, the notion of Abraham, and Abraham being the sort of this core, as it says, through you will be blessed all of civilization. And in fact, one of the interpretations of the Ibn Ezra is v'nivrachu, from the word mavrich. Mavrich means to graft, that you will be grafted into the families of the world. Right? Somebody once pointed out, interestingly enough, that Sarah comes from Shem, right? And Hagar is a Mitzrit, right? So Hagar comes from Shem, Cham, and Yafet, right? The three children of Noach, right? Sarah is a Semite. She comes from Shem, right? Cham comes from, I think, Cham, and because she's Egyptian. And then there was a third one, Keturah, and Keturah comes from Yafet. And in that case, then we would have a situation in which we actually have Abraham literally grafted into the three branches of humanity according to Bereshit, but whichever way, Abraham is this major character. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to share the video where Rabbi Sacks actually summarizes this book. It's a 6-minute video, and we have precisely 6 minutes. So let's try and do this. Okay. Just 1 minute.
Why I am a Jew. The deepest question any of us can ask is, who am I? To answer it, we have to go deeper than where do I live or what do I do? The most fateful moment in my life came when I asked myself that question and knew the answer had to be, I am a Jew. This is why. I'm a Jew not because I believe that Judaism contains all there is of the human story. I admire other traditions and their contributions to the world. Nor am I a Jew because of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism. What happens to me does not define who I am. Ours is a people of faith, not fate. Nor is it because I think that Jews are better than others, more intelligent, creative, generous, or successful. It's not Jews who are different, but Judaism. It's not so much what we are, but what we're called on to be. I'm a Jew because, being a child of my people, I have heard the call to add my chapter to its unfinished story. I'm a stage on its journey, a connecting link between the generations. The dreams and hopes of my ancestors live on in me, and I am the guardian of their trust, now and for the future. I'm a Jew because our ancestors were the first to see that the world is driven by a moral purpose, that reality isn't a ceaseless war of the elements to be worshipped as gods, nor history a battle in which might is right and power is to be appeased. The Judaic tradition shaped the moral civilization of the West, teaching for the first time that human life is sacred, that the individual may never be sacrificed for the mass, and that rich and poor, great and small, are all equal before God. I'm a Jew because I am the moral heir of those who stood at the foot of Mount Sinai and pledged themselves to live by these truths for all time. I'm the descendant of countless generations of ancestors who, though sorely tested and bitterly tried, remained faithful to that covenant when they might so easily have defected. I'm a Jew because of Shabbat, the world's greatest religious institution, a time in which there's no manipulation of nature or our fellow human beings, in which we come together in freedom and equality to create every week an anticipation of the Messianic age. I'm a Jew because our nation, though at times it suffered the deepest poverty, never gave up on its commitment to helping the poor or rescuing Jews from other lands or fighting for justice for the oppressed, and did so without self-congratulation, because it was a mitzvah, because a Jew could do no less. I'm a Jew because I cherish the Torah, knowing that God is to be found not just in natural forces, but in moral meanings, in words, texts, teachings, and commands, and because Jews, though they lacked all else, never ceased to value education as a sacred task, endowing the individual with dignity and depth. I'm a Jew because of our people's passionate faith in freedom, holding that each of us is a moral agent, and that in this lies our unique dignity as human beings. And because Judaism never left its ideals at the level of lofty aspirations, but instead translated them into deeds which we call mitzvot, and a way which we call the halakha, and thus brought heaven down to earth. I am proud, simply, to be a Jew. I'm proud to be part of a people who, though scarred and traumatized, never lost their humor or their faith, their ability to laugh at present troubles and still believe in ultimate redemption, who saw human history as a journey and never stopped traveling and searching. I'm proud to be part of an age in which my people, ravaged by the worst crime ever to be committed against a people, responded by reviving a land, recovering their sovereignty, rescuing threatened Jews throughout the world, rebuilding Jerusalem, and proving themselves courageous in the pursuit of peace, no less than in defending themselves in war. I'm proud that our ancestors refused to be satisfied with premature consolations, and in answer to the question, has the Messiah come? Always answered, not yet. I'm proud to belong to the people Israel, whose name means one who wrestles with God and with man and prevails. For though we have loved humanity, we have never stopped wrestling with it, challenging the idols of every age. And though we have loved God with an everlasting love, we've never stopped wrestling with Him, nor He with us. I admire other civilizations and traditions, and believe each has brought something special into the world. Aval zeh shalanu. But this is ours. This is my people, my heritage, my faith. In our uniqueness lies our universality. Through being what we alone are, we give to humanity what only we can give. This then is our story, our gift to the next generation. I received it from my parents and they from theirs, across great expanses of space and time. There's nothing quite like it. It changed and still challenges the moral imagination of humankind. I want to say to Jews around the world, take it. Cherish it, learn to understand and to love it. Carry it, and it will carry you. And may you, in turn, pass it on to future generations. For you are a member of an eternal people, a letter in their scroll. Let their eternity live on in you.
Okay, so that's what we have for today. And thank you all for joining. I hope you got I have to tell you, one of the difficulties of this whole endeavor is, so I'm giving you a taste of the books, but as Hillel once said, you know, this is like learning the Torah on one foot. And Idach Zil Gemara, you're just going to have to go and read the book to really appreciate it in its full color. Next week, we are going to start looking at Rabbi Sacks's sort of like political social philosophy in 2 books. Well, it really starts with the Wreath Lectures, but we're going to look at the Politics of Hope and his later book, Morality. One is from 1997 and one is from 2020, and yet they both contain the same basic thesis. And it'll, many ways, be able to follow on from what we did today. In other shiurim, in future classes, we're going to look at Rabbi Sacks's Siddur and some of his ideas on prayer and leadership. And also, we're going to spend a class on talking about his attitude to Israel. So, the state of Israel and various different aspects of that. So, look forward to seeing you again, this same place, same time next week. Bezrat Hashem.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Israel, and thank you so much for all the participants who joined us today, not only here on Zoom, but also on Facebook. Such a great class. Just a few announcements. The deadline for our virtual summer Kollel program has been extended now by a couple of weeks. So if you were meaning to apply, here's your chance, 2 more weeks. You can learn more and submit your application at kollel.drisha.org. There are also a few spots left in each of our girls' summer programs. So if you have any young Talmidot in your life, encourage them to finish up their application as well. We always have many classes happening during this month and in general. You can visit our website at drisha.org to register for classes and find out about any other classes that might interest you. And for now, lehitraot, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.